This is the third installment of our fall Bible study, journeying through the New Testament Bible lands. And we are going now through Paul's journey through the information we get through his letters and the book of Acts, written by Luke, the gospel writer. And Acts follows Paul and many other apostles. So we will probably encounter a few of them along the way as well in our journey through pictures and the lands in which they traveled. So here we have an overview of where we are going to go, starting in Damascus, where Saul became Paul, that Damascus Road experience of conversion. There's also Syria, Antioch, Corinth, Athens, Philippi, Galatia, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and a few other places that we will see along the way. And so we'll get back to this information shortly. Here is a map of a lot of the places that were traveled by Paul and the apostles. In the bottom right corner, you can see Palestine, and then up from there, Damascus, and then seeing how he goes up through the land of Antioch and into what is now modern Turkey and up to Greece. And he would have traveled by land up through and then gone by sea to go back down to Jerusalem, as he had many missionary journeys and would go back and forth to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles for councils. Here is a more modern map of the area. And so you see how close Syria is to Israel, particularly Damascus down there at the bottom. And you see how the land mass of Syria is smaller. It would have gone further up into what is now modern day Turkey. And now we are in Damascus, and you see in this area, Damascus, you have some ancient ruins there on the right, and how they are surrounded by modern buildings. And some places there are ancient ruins that have a lot of building around it for that sacred space. And then there are places in these ancient societies that are modern society is just all right around it. And then on the left, you see the garden passageway at St. Ananias Church. Ananias is the one that welcomed in Saul as he was blind and took on a very difficult but faithful journey of helping heal Saul to become Paul. Another part of Damascus, you've got the St. George Syrian Orthodox Church, and know that there was separations in early church. And so anytime people are upset about what is happening with denominational separations, there is so many of those things happening just from the beginning of the church. And so the Orthodox, there's a few different types of Orthodox churches. There's Eastern Orthodox, there's Syrian Orthodox, there's Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. Then you've got the Coptic Church, the Armenian Church, let alone then Catholic, and then Protestant. You get into that even further. And so there's just some different parts of theology and the way that they practice their faith. And so that's all important in that. And then you've got the Umayyad Mosque. And know that our traditions of Muslim and Judaism and Christianity all are Abrahamic faith traditions. And so they're sharing a very special place amongst the religions. And so sometimes mosques were built around Christian things and were preserved by just kind of plastering over, and some were preserved by keeping a piece of that. And so this mosque is thought to be the burial place of John the Baptist's head. It's also thought to be the place where Jesus will return at the end of days. And so an interesting way in which putting all of the faith traditions here. So we've traveled to Damascus, and before we get to Antioch, I do want to take a quick mention about Arabia. In Galatians, as it was written several decades later, Paul talked about being taught personally by Jesus for a few years in Arabia. We're not going to get to that, but just a fascinating piece of information. And Antioch was Syria at the time, and there's two parts of Antioch, and so there's Antioch that's further south, and then there's the Antioch of Turkey. But this is a very important place, as in Acts 11 it is talked about where the disciples were for the first time called Christians. And Paul arrived in Antioch in 43 and spent time preaching the gospel. And it was a center of many of his missionary activities, as he had three very specific big missionary journeys. And Syria, Antioch was very much a part of that. On the left here is a map, kind of simply going through these travels of Paul, moving from Jerusalem up through Syria over to Antioch and Tarsus, and then back through the Mediterranean Sea. And this is just a piece of those missionary journeys, as Paul made three specific journeys, and then that fourth, the moving towards Rome, where he had his inevitable death. On the right is an older illustration of the ancient ruins in this area of Damascus, of Syria, of a way in which Syria is a place of a lot of bombings a couple years ago. And so some of the things that were there years ago, as archaeological evidence had uncovered and rebuilt, has been blown up as of late. Syria and Antioch, especially, Antioch is the cradle of Christianity, as seen and remembered in Acts 11. And so here is a little marketplace, ancient road, and then you've got St. Pete's Cave Church. What's amazing when I experienced my travels in Turkey was how God created these caves that then people were able to use. Here you see a more modern facade where there is doors and carved areas, but early on there was caves where frescoes and things that were hidden so that people could gather together in worship without persecution or martyrdom. And so caves were a very significant place for the early church to be able to gather together to worship, but also to stay safe together. We're going to jump over to Athens, as it was a place that I was able to personally visit. It was the first place I got to step onto from my college journey over to the Greece and Turkey. And so Areopagus is just this beautiful hillside. Think about how Stone Mountain is something that people climb up and look, and on a clear day you can look out to the city. Well, the Areopagus was just this rock formation where people gathered for wisdom and philosophy and conversation, but you have around you just a scene of a variety of temples, a variety of amphitheaters, of training grounds, of statues. But this was this open area that was very different. And Paul was such a intriguing force, and God put together this individual who understood a lot of things. He was Jew by religion, and then came to believe in Jesus and followed the way. He was also a Roman citizen, which allowed for him to have access to certain areas, access to understanding, and he was also able to save himself from harsher demise earlier on, as he was imprisoned many times. But as a Roman citizen, he was able to get through some of those imprisonments until his end in Rome. But what he did in Athens was significant. He looked around, and this is where you see a difference between how he treated Gentile populations and Jewish populations in understanding Christianity. He took his understanding of Greek philosophy and used philosophy as a way to share the good news of the gospel. And so he saw this tomb to the unknown, this temple to the unknown God, and said, what if? And gave them the idea of philosophy to think about the what ifs. And that's really significant in his time, and still is, in thinking about how we do evangelism. A little pop over to Corinth. This was part of Paul's second missionary journey, and he stayed there for over a year, as seen in Acts 18, and he was able to sail back to Antioch in Syria, and this is where Priscilla and Aquila joined Paul it was this beautiful landscape area, and you see these ancient ruins to temples and to marketplaces, and it was kind of secluded from any kind of local building, anything that was. It was all kind of tourist from this ancient ruin ability to see this, and so it makes for archaeology and excavation a lot easier, but also it's further from the path, so it's not quite as excavated as some other areas, but beautiful nonetheless to see the scenery around. And there was some other places in Greece that you got to see, that I got to see, that were just fascinating, of what was still around, what was excavated, what was kept over centuries and centuries of the earth and life, and how life could have been lived back then. So, some other places that Paul visited: Philippi, Thessalonica, Galatia, and a little bit of how Paul spent his time there, how he saw places of prayer, where he met certain people. Philippi is where he met Lydia, who was a trader in purple fabrics. She was someone that probably had a lot of money and helped build this. Thessalonica is where he visited with Timothy and Silas. And remember, Silas was someone that he visited a lot of places with. And Galatia was somewhere in his first missionary journey, as it was a bit closer to Antioch than some of the other Greek areas. And so here we have these areas that were really important to these missionary journeys. And we see Philippi, Philippians, Thessalonica, Thessalonians, Galatia, Galatians. So he had these back and forth correspondence between these churches after his missionary journey with them. Here's a quick view of Philippi. It's not a place that I got to visit, so these pictures came from online search. And you see this beautiful bird's eye view of the area where the temple is, where those large columns were, where there was some marketplace areas. And so this probably would have been the main city part of Philippi. Then you see further out this gorgeous amphitheater, and they gathered together for music, for theater, for entertainment, for conversation. And it shows you the difference between cities that had time and space to do that, as opposed to just trying to survive. And so here then also is a view of something that was commemorated as a prison of Paul, one of the many times he was imprisoned, and so it's just a space of interest for the Christian church. Here we are now at Thessalonica, and a little anecdote about the difference between how we read Greek in biblical times, so Koine Greek, and the modern Greek, was this town, the city. My college professor, a Bible scholar, and he even taught Koine Greek for college classes, he argued the term, this city name is Thessalonica or Thessalonica, and our tour guide, a Greek, she argued it was Thessaloniki, and it was even spelled Nika, a difference between the end of the spelling here. So just a little tidbit about the difference between how biblical Greek is read and modern Greek. And we saw this a lot in the city names, but there were some other things that we recognized, especially when I was in seminary and my journey to Greece, and seeing some of those differences as I had gotten to study Greek by that point. So just to talk about these pictures, up at the top is a map kind of reminding you of where you are. So Asia Minor, that Turkey area, that's Ephesus and things like that. And then up is Philippi at the top, and then Thessalonica, that would have been Macedonia area, Berea, and then down further into Greece, of that time Athens, and how close but far away in the same way is Corinth, between land and sea. And then at the bottom right, you see the difference between those ancient ruins and modern building. And you see how things were kind of below and above, and how different we see some of that, and maybe what was covered underneath, kind of like a basement of today. And then you see this beautiful 4th century Church of St. Demetrius. And you see the difference in building construction of 4th century as opposed to ancient times, as opposed to modern. And you see the differences of 4th century church as opposed to many of that Greek and Roman look of that 1st century area. And quickly, a beautiful landscape of the Galatia area, and then the ancient ruins in that area as well. We move on to a place that I found was really fascinating, and I could have a whole lot more to say about this place, as I was in awe of going to Ephesus off the coast of Turkey. This was where Apollos taught about John the Baptist and then Jesus. And Paul was in the synagogue for 3 months before moving to the hall of Tyrannus, where he spoke daily about God and the word of God. So he was in the synagogues in Ephesus. There were some problems, and so he moved to the open market area, and he continued to talk to all the residents of Asia, which is now modern Turkey, who heard the word of the Lord, as seen in Acts 19. And just a quick mention, some other places that you might have seen in the map that aren't mentioned here. Of course, Jerusalem, which we've talked a lot about through Jesus and the Gospels, Cyprus, Acacia, Crete, Macedonia, and Troas, which was part of his missionary journey, a part of some of the other apostles' journey as well. The coast town of Ephesus doesn't look like a coast town, does it? If you look out, you see mountains and a lot of land. You don't see a coastal area. Well, the ancient city of Ephesus was right by the coast, but more land has appeared as waters have receded over time. And so what was a coastal town is now further in to the coast, not quite so close to the coastline. And so here's this beautiful walkway, that tall building in the distance, and that building on the right is the facade of the library. What a beautiful facade. And you see some entrances, and you see the amphitheater over there in that distance on the bottom right. And it's just such a gorgeous area. And it was all very large and compact, kind of like a way that cities are. And so what was neat about Ephesus is you could really see everything: the library, the amphitheater, places of wisdom, temple, marketplace. It kind of had it all, but it was open air and ruins in a different way than what you would see like in the old city of Jerusalem, where it was just compact and it was still busy and working as a modern city and within an old city. And so we saw latrines, we saw ancient graffiti, we saw ancient advertising of the Red District, if you can guess what that was for. So it kind of hit everything that you could see in maybe an ancient 1st century bustling town city. Here are some views of things that were Christian of that in Ephesus. One is this baptismal font. You would walk in down the stairs and you would be baptized in this viewpoint. And so it was a different way of baptism than we as Protestants today baptize, as we sprinkle instead of dunk. And they dunked even in a different way. You walk in and you walk out in dead to sin and alive to Christ. And so in ancient times, there was ways in which the persecuted church shared who they were. Now, we wear crosses around our necks or have crosses in our churches. But remember, in that time, the cross was still very much a death instrument of the government. It was not this symbol of Christianity in the same way. In fact, many times crosses were a little too obvious, and so the ancient peoples, the first Christians, when they would talk to another person, they would draw in the sand the fish figure that we had seen not too long ago on cars and other places, is that fish figure, that disciples of men, fishers of men. Now in Ephesus, I saw this, and on the left you see it in a carved marble, but I also saw it on marble carved, like you would see a kid carving into a desk, any kind of graffiti, but it looked like a pizza pie. And we were like, what is this? And he said, well, people caught on to the fit and you had to find a way to mark who you were. And so they use this as an indescript marking. And it is that those Greek letters kind of all put together, the iota, the other pieces. And so you have the pizza pie of the forward, the Y, the X, Jesus Christ, Son of God, in Greek letters. And you see it, and it just kind of looks like a pizza pie. Rome, the last stop for Paul. He had written to the Romans years before, but then his end of life was at Rome. And so just to show you kind of an overview picture of some ancient ruins up at that top right, then the Roman insula, which would have been apartments, smaller area, because again, it was a huge city where people were coming and going, living in much closer quarters than some of these places where people would go into the city to trade and to do market and to do business, but then live in hovels and places outside of the city. Whereas here, people were living in the city and outside of the city. And on the bottom right is a picture, and it could have been maybe where someone had caged in saying this part of marble was right where Paul's feet were, and it became this sacred space. But I didn't have a lot of information about that, so I can't guarantee that's what that picture is. But knowing from other visits of this is where they believed so-and-so was standing, and then they made a way to make it very sacred and not touchable. Before we end, I do want to take note of some of our other apostles. Thomas possibly went to India, Matthew to Ethiopia, Philip, Bartholomew to Rome, Andrew to Greece. And as you see, this other places where they were thought to have been, where they were thought to have died, where there was just other epistles and conversations of how they all spread out, some of which came from scripture, some of which came from extra biblical knowledge as well. And so we remember that there were apostles that were spread. They were told to the Great Commission to go to all the nations to baptize in the name of Jesus, to make them disciples, fishers of men, fishers of people all over. And so different churches were founded by these apostles, some of which kept up, and some of which we didn't find out some information until much later in our understanding of biblical Christianity as well as international Christianity, of ancient sources and of modern times through our missionary journeys in the much closer past. Thank you all for listening to this Bible study. I hope that it was helpful in your information and learning, and that it encourages you to learn more, to ask questions, to dig in, to seek ways in which we understand our biblical connection through land and through places that were long ago, those excavated and those lived in today.